Alice Coleman had spent years meticulously crafting the life she had now. After 2 decades of working in high-stakes corporate litigation, she had finally stepped away from the relentless grind of legal warfare, choosing instead to consult on cases rather than fight them in court. The stress of her career had cost her a lot: relationships, health, and most importantly, peace of mind. Moving out of the city had been her way of reclaiming that. She had chosen this particular neighborhood for its reputation: quiet, safe, well-maintained, and most crucially, private. Her house was an elegant, modern 2-story with high fences, a spacious backyard, and the one thing she had always wanted but never had the time or space for: a pristine in-ground pool. It wasn't just for leisure, it was a symbol of her hard-earned success, a space entirely her own, a place where she could finally relax without the constant hum of deadlines, negotiations, and legal battles weighing on her shoulders. She had envisioned long afternoons reading by the water, morning swims to start the day, and warm summer evenings with a glass of wine, listening to nothing but the chirping of cicadas and the soft ripple of water. She had not, however, envisioned Rebecca Langley. Alice first encountered Rebecca 3 weeks after moving in. She had been outside tending to the plants along her fence line when she heard an overly cheerful voice call out from the other side. Looking up, she saw a woman standing at the gate with an eager smile, her 2 children standing beside her, fidgeting with the impatient energy of kids who had been made to accompany an adult on a dull errand. The woman had the kind of polished suburban aesthetic that suggested meticulous upkeep: a crisp sundress, perfectly styled blonde hair, makeup applied with the careful precision of someone who wanted to appear effortlessly put together. "Hi there, you must be the new neighbor. I'm Rebecca. I live just a few houses down. Thought I'd come introduce myself." Alice, who had been about to reach for her watering can, straightened up and wiped her hands on her jeans before responding. "Alice Coleman. Nice to meet you." She didn't particularly feel like chatting, but the last thing she wanted was to come off as rude to the people she would be living near. Rebecca's gaze flicked past her, settling on the pool, and Alice immediately recognized the look: curiosity, interest, calculation. "That's a gorgeous pool," Rebecca said, tilting her head slightly, the way people did when they were about to follow a compliment with a request. "It must be amazing having one all to yourself." Alice offered a neutral smile, not wanting to encourage wherever this conversation was headed. "Yeah, I love it," Rebecca sighed, a little too dramatically. "You know, ever since they changed the rules for the community pool, it's just not the same. So many outsiders coming in, and you never really know who you'll run into there. It used to be such a nice place for families." The pointed way she said it made Alice's stomach turn slightly. She had spent enough time dissecting subtext in legal documents to recognize a veiled implication when she heard one. She ignored it. "I haven't been there," she replied flatly. "Oh, you're not missing much," Rebecca assured her. Then, as if the thought had just occurred to her, she added, "You know, my kids absolutely love swimming, and with summer coming up, I've been looking for ways to keep them busy. Maybe they could use your pool sometime?" "I'd be here with them, of course." Alice had dealt with entitled people before: corporate executives who thought they could bend the law to their will, clients who expected miracles without putting in any effort, colleagues who mistook arrogance for intelligence, but she still found herself taken aback by the sheer audacity of someone she had just met acting as if her property was up for negotiation. She kept her expression polite but firm. "I'm sorry, but the pool is private. It's not something I'm open to sharing." Rebecca's smile faltered for half a second before she quickly recovered, letting out a light laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, of course, I totally understand. I just figured neighbors help each other out. But no worries, I'll figure something else out for them." There was a subtle shift in her tone, a barely perceptible edge beneath the sweetness. Alice recognized it immediately: the way people smiled when they didn't like being told no but weren't ready to push the issue outright. She had seen that look in courtrooms, in negotiation rooms, in the faces of clients who didn't hear what they wanted to hear. It didn't matter. No was no. Over the next few days, Alice started noticing little things that made her uneasy. At first they were small, easy to dismiss as coincidence or forgetfulness. A pool chair slightly out of place, a faint imprint of wet footprints near the water's edge, even though she hadn't used the pool that day, the distinct scent of sunscreen lingering in the air when she stepped outside in the morning. She checked the gate, the locks, the pool cover, everything was secure. She told herself she was being paranoid, that she had just forgotten moving the chair, that maybe the footprints had been from the last time she swam and she hadn't noticed them before. But then came the night she heard laughter, children's laughter, soft but unmistakable, drifting through the open window. She had been in bed, reading, when the sound reached her. At first she thought it was coming from somewhere else, maybe another yard. But as she sat up, listening more closely, a chill crawled down her spine. The sound wasn't distant. It was coming from her backyard. She threw off the covers and grabbed her phone, heart pounding as she moved quickly toward the back door. Peering through the glass, she felt her breath catch in her throat. Rebecca was sitting on one of her lounge chairs, legs crossed, a drink in hand, watching her 2 children splash in the pool, as if they had every right to be there. Alice yanked the door open, stepping out onto the patio, her voice sharp with disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" Rebecca looked up, entirely unbothered. "Oh, Alice, you're home. We thought you were out." "The kids were dying to swim, and I figured, why let the pool go to waste?" Her tone was light, almost amused, as if she wasn't blatantly trespassing on someone else's property. The sheer gall of it rendered Alice momentarily speechless. Then, regaining her composure, she pulled out her phone. "Get out, now. Or I'm calling the police." Rebecca's expression darkened, her easygoing demeanor flickering for just a second before she let out an exaggerated sigh and gestured for her kids to get out of the water. All right, no need to be dramatic. We're leaving." As she gathered her things, she shot Alice a knowing look. "I just thought we were being neighborly. But if you want to be like this, well. Okay. Just remember, Alice, we all have to live together in this community. You might not want to make enemies." Alice watched them walk out of her yard, her fingers gripping the phone so tightly her knuckles ached. She waited until they were gone, then immediately locked the gate behind them, double-checking every latch. As she stood there, staring at the still rippling water, one thing became clear. Rebecca hadn't just crossed a line, she had obliterated it, and Alice had a sinking feeling this was only the beginning. Alice barely slept that night, even after Rebecca and her children had left. After she had double-checked every lock and reinforced the backyard gate, a restless unease settled over her, making it impossible to relax. She replayed the scene over and over in her head, trying to wrap her mind around the sheer audacity of it. Rebecca hadn't just ignored a polite refusal, she had outright violated her property, waltzed in as if she belonged there, acted like Alice was the unreasonable one for not wanting strangers in her pool. And the way she had spoken before leaving, casual, almost amused, but laced with something darker, had left a sour taste in Alice's mouth. It was a threat veiled beneath passive-aggressive sweetness, a warning disguised as neighborly advice. But what unnerved Alice the most was how easily Rebecca had done it, as if she had been in control of the situation the entire time. Morning came too quickly, and Alice woke up feeling drained, her thoughts still spinning as she went through her usual routine. She made coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and stared out at the pool, the water still and undisturbed now, as if the night before had been a fever dream. But the proof was there: the misplaced pool float, the damp towels Rebecca's children had left behind, the faint scent of chlorine that didn't belong to her usual cleaning routine. She needed to take action. She refused to let this go. Letting it slide would be an invitation for Rebecca to push further. If she could invade Alice's privacy once without consequence, what was stopping her from doing it again? She grabbed her phone and called the non-emergency police line, explaining the situation as calmly as she could. The officer on the other end listened patiently, but Alice could tell by his tone that he wasn't taking it as seriously as she wanted him to. "Look, technically it's trespassing," he said, "but unless she broke in or caused damage, it's going to be tough to do much about it. I can send someone out to take a report, but unless she comes back or makes a direct threat, there's not a lot we can charge her with." Alice gritted her teeth. Of course. She had spent enough time around the legal system to know how these things worked. Without tangible damage or a repeated offense, it would be treated as nothing more than a neighborhood dispute. Still, she agreed to file the report. Even if it didn't result in immediate action, at least it would be on record. By the time the officer arrived, a middle-aged man with tired eyes and a practiced air of indifference, Alice had already printed out security footage from her camera's grainy stills of Rebecca and her children in the pool. The officer took notes, asked her a few routine questions, and left with the promise that someone would follow up if it happened again. Alice knew that was just a polite way of saying, "Nothing will come of this." Still, she wasn't going to sit around and wait for another incident. That afternoon, she called a locksmith and had new locks installed on both the side gate and the backyard entrance. She also ordered a secondary security system, motion-activated floodlights, and an updated camera setup that would send alerts directly to her phone. If Rebecca thought she could come and go as she pleased, she was in for a rude awakening. For a few days, things were quiet. Too quiet. No unexpected footprints near the pool, no subtle signs of intrusion, no forced neighborly interactions. Alice started to think, maybe, just maybe, Rebecca had taken the hint. But then, late one evening, as she stepped out onto her patio with a glass of wine, she found something that made her blood run cold. A swimsuit. A child's swimsuit, neatly folded and placed on one of the lounge chairs by the pool. Alice's stomach twisted. It hadn't been there earlier. She was sure of it. Someone had put it there while she was inside. She spun around, scanning the yard, the fence, the trees beyond the property line. The air was still, the street quiet, no movement, no signs of anyone lingering. But the message was clear. This wasn't over. Anger burned through her initial fear. Enough was enough. She stormed inside, grabbed her phone, and dialed Rebecca's number. She had saved it from the neighborhood contact list she'd received when she moved in. The call rang twice before Rebecca picked up, her voice infuriatingly casual. "Alice, how nice of you to call. What's up?" Alice clenched her jaw. "Don't play dumb. You left something at my house." There was a pause, just long enough for Alice to imagine the smug smile on Rebecca's face. "I don't know what you mean." "You know exactly what I mean," Alice snapped. "The swimsuit. By my pool. If you or your kids set foot on my property again, I will press charges. Do you understand me?" Rebecca let out a soft laugh, the sound grating. "Oh, Alice, you're so dramatic. It's just a swimsuit. Maybe the wind blew it over from my yard." Alice's grip on her phone tightened. "We both know that's bullshit." Rebecca sighed, the way a mother might when dealing with a petulant child. "Look, I think you're getting worked up over nothing. We're neighbors, Alice. Things happen. No need to be so hostile. Stay off my property." "Fine," Rebecca said breezily. "If it bothers you that much, I'll make sure the kids don't misplace anything near your precious pool again." The call ended, but Alice didn't feel any better. If anything, she felt worse. Because Rebecca wasn't scared. She wasn't embarrassed or apologetic. She was entertained. The next morning, Alice found her trash bins knocked over, garbage strewn across the driveway. It could have been a coincidence. An animal, maybe, but she doubted it. The day after that, her mailbox had been left open, several of her letters missing. Small, petty things. Nothing that could be proven, but enough to make it clear that Rebecca had no intention of backing off. It was a game to her, a slow, methodical push against Alice's patience, testing how far she could go before Alice snapped. That evening, Alice installed the new security system. She set up alerts, checked the camera angles, made sure everything was backed up to the cloud. If Rebecca tried anything again, there would be no deniability. She didn't have to wait long. At 3:12 a.m., her phone buzzed with a motion alert. Heart pounding, she grabbed the device and pulled up the live feed. The backyard camera showed a grainy figure standing just beyond the fence line. Rebecca. She wasn't trying to get in this time. She was just standing there, staring at the pool, watching. Alice's skin prickled. Then, as if sensing she was being watched in return, Rebecca slowly turned her head toward the camera. She smiled. And then she walked away. Alice barely slept after seeing Rebecca on the security footage. That unsettling smile, the way she had turned toward the camera, as if she knew Alice was watching it, wasn't just eerie, it was deliberate. It wasn't the expression of someone caught in the act, scrambling to cover up their trespassing. No, it was something worse. It was amusement. It was a silent message: I know you see me, and I don't care. She spent the rest of the night checking the locks, pacing the house, replaying the footage over and over, trying to make sense of what Rebecca wanted. Was it just about the pool? Was this some kind of sick power play, a test to see how far she could push before Alice snapped? Or was it something deeper, something Alice hadn't yet figured out? She told herself she was being paranoid, that Rebecca was just an entitled neighbor who didn't like being told no. But the way she had stood there in the dark, motionless, just watching it wasn't normal. By the time morning arrived, Alice had made a decision. She wasn't going to let this continue. She had tried being civil, she had tried setting boundaries, and none of it had worked. Now it was time to escalate things on her terms. The first thing she did was take the footage to the police station. She had no illusions that they would throw Rebecca in jail, but she needed to establish a pattern of behavior. The officer at the desk, a younger man who looked like he was barely out of training, raised an eyebrow as he watched the video. So, she's just standing there. His tone wasn't dismissive, but it wasn't exactly urgent either. Yes, Alice said, forcing herself to stay calm. But this isn't the first time. She's been on my property before. She let herself into my yard with her kids. She left things behind. She's been tampering with my mail, knocking over my trash bins. Now she's just lurking outside my fence in the middle of the night. This isn't normal, the officer nodded, jotting something down. Have you had any direct confrontations with her? Threats, verbal altercations. I told her to stay off my property, and she laughed it off, Alice said. Last time we spoke, she basically implied that I was the problem for not wanting to share my pool, the officer sighed. Look, I can file a report. But unless she actually steps onto your property again, there's not a lot we can do. If she breaks in, that's one thing. If she just stands there, that's another. Alice clenched her jaw. So I have to wait until she does something worse? No, the officer said quickly. But right now, legally speaking, she hasn't committed a crime we can charge her with. Harassment is tricky unless there's a direct pattern of threats or property damage. My advice? Get a restraining order. If she violates that, then we can act. Alice left the station feeling no safer than when she arrived, but at least now she had official documentation of Rebecca's behavior. The next step was contacting a lawyer. She spent the afternoon making calls, finally securing a consultation with someone who specialized in property disputes and restraining orders. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Evelyn Carter, listened intently as Alice laid out everything that had happened. You're not overreacting, Evelyn said when Alice finished. This is classic boundary testing. She started small, pushing just enough to see what you'd let slide. Now that you've pushed back, she's doubling down. If you ignore this, it'll get worse. What do I do? Alice asked. File for a restraining order, immediately, Evelyn said. It's not guaranteed to be granted, but given that she's already trespassed once and is now lurking outside your home, we have enough to argue that she poses a threat to your peace and safety. If you get the order and she violates it, the police will have to take action. Alice nodded, already feeling a small sense of relief, just having someone on her side who understood what she was dealing with. And in the meantime, keep your security tight. Document everything. If she steps onto your property again, call the police immediately. And whatever you do, do not engage with her. No more calls, no more confrontations. She wants a reaction. Don't give her one. Alice took the advice to heart. That night, she adjusted her security system, setting up extra cameras with overlapping views of the backyard and driveway. She double-checked every lock, placed a heavy wooden bar across the sliding door track, and even installed a secondary lock on the front door. She wasn't going to make it easy for Rebecca to pull whatever stunt she had planned next, and she was certain there would be a next. She didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, at 2:46 a.m., Alice's phone buzzed with a motion alert. She sat up instantly, heart hammering, as she grabbed the device and pulled up the live feed. The backyard camera showed movement near the gate. But it wasn't just Rebecca this time. There were two figures. Rebecca and a man. Alice's blood turned to ice as she watched Rebecca whisper something to the man before gesturing toward the fence. He nodded, then reached into his pocket and pulled out something metallic. Alice's breath caught. a key. She didn't have time to process how he had gotten it, whether it was stolen, copied, or something worse, because in the next second, he was testing it against the lock. Alice didn't think. She acted. She grabbed the phone and dialed 911, her voice steady but urgent as she relayed the situation. "There's someone at my house trying to get in through my backyard gate. One of them is my neighbor, the other is a man I don't recognize. He has a key." "Stay on the line," the dispatcher said. "Officers are en route." Alice didn't wait. She turned on every exterior light she had, flooding the backyard in harsh white brightness. The man jerked back, startled, and Rebecca spun around, shielding her eyes. Alice stormed onto the patio, phone still in hand. "Get the fuck off my property." Rebecca's expression morphed into something ugly, her usual saccharine smile twisting into a scowl. "Calm down, Alice. You're overreacting. The police are on their way," Alice snapped. "Try explaining to them why you're breaking into my yard in the middle of the night." The man muttered something under his breath before turning to leave, but Rebecca hesitated, glaring at Alice with something close to contempt. "You really don't know how to be a good neighbor, do you?" Alice took a step forward. "You really don't know when to stop, do you?" Rebecca's jaw clenched. Then, without another word, she turned and followed the man back into the shadows. By the time the police arrived, they were gone. Alice handed over the security footage, pointed out the key the man had tried to use, and this time she didn't get the usual brush off. The officers took her statement seriously, marking it as an attempted break-in. They went to Rebecca's house, but she refused to answer the door. The next morning, Alice got a call from Evelyn. "The restraining order went through," she said. "Rebecca is officially barred from coming near your property. If she does, she gets arrested." It should have been a relief. It should have been the end of it. But Alice knew better. Rebecca wasn't the type to back down. And Alice wasn't about to let her win. Alice knew that obtaining the restraining order was a crucial step, but it didn't mean she could relax. If anything, it made her more alert. Rebecca had already proven that she didn't respect boundaries, that she saw rules as obstacles rather than limitations. She had ignored every warning, pushed every chance at civility past its breaking point, and now she had escalated to outright criminal behavior. The fact that she had brought someone with her, a man Alice didn't recognize, someone who had a key to her property, made it clear that this wasn't over. Rebecca wasn't just some entitled suburban mother who felt like she was owed access to Alice's pool. No, this was deeper. This was calculated. There was something about the way Rebecca had looked at her before leaving that night, the way she had held Alice's gaze just a second too long, as if she were measuring something. That wasn't frustration. That wasn't even anger. That was a challenge. Alice spent the next few days reinforcing her home further, hiring a security company to install additional locks, replace her gate entirely, and upgrade her alarm system to direct police response. She made sure every entry point was as impenetrable as possible. Every movement outside the house was logged, every alert from her cameras immediately reviewed. She refused to be caught off guard again. But despite the added layers of security, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. It wasn't paranoia, it was something more instinctive, the kind of awareness that prickled at the base of her neck when she stepped outside to check the mail or walk to her car in the driveway. The neighbors had started looking at her differently, too. Some avoided eye contact when she passed them on the sidewalk. Others whispered as she walked by, their conversation stopping abruptly when she got too close. It didn't take long for Alice to realize that Rebecca had been talking, spinning whatever narrative suited her best. At the grocery store, she caught snippets of hushed conversations such as shame, new people should try to fit in, not create problems. And some people just don't know how to be part of a community. Alice wasn't naive. She knew that in places like this, perception was everything. It didn't matter what the truth was, it mattered what people believed to be true. And Rebecca, with her practiced charm and carefully curated persona, had made sure that Alice was the outsider. She found out just how deep it ran a few days later when she received an official-looking letter in the mail. At first, she assumed it was something regarding the restraining order, or an update from the police about the attempted break-in. But when she opened it, her stomach dropped. It was a notice of violation. According to the letter, her pool was in violation of local safety codes, and she was being ordered to cease all use until further inspections could be completed. The supposed infractions were vague: improperly secured access, potential hazard to community safety, but the message was clear. Someone had reported her, and there was no question in Alice's mind who it had been. She spent the next 2 hours making calls, trying to understand how this had happened. The inspection had already been scheduled without her consent, and when she demanded to know who had filed the complaint, she was met with the usual bureaucratic runaround: complaints are anonymous, ma-am, but these things are taken very seriously. Alice clenched her jaw. This wasn't about safety. This was Rebecca playing another game, using whatever influence she had to make Alice's life as difficult as possible. By the time the inspector arrived, Alice was seething but composed. The man, an older gentleman with a clipboard and a neutral expression, walked through the backyard with methodical efficiency, taking notes as he surveyed the area. Alice followed closely, arms crossed, waiting for whatever nonsense Rebecca had concocted to justify this harassment. The inspector finally turned to her with a measured expression. "I'm going to be honest with you," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "Your pool is fine, everything is up to code, but I have to go through the process because of the complaint. It's procedure." Alice exhaled sharply, nodding. "And let me guess, you can't tell me who filed it." The inspector gave her a look that told her everything she needed to know. He wasn't allowed to confirm it, but he also wasn't denying it. "I see a lot of things in my line of work," he said carefully. "I've seen people weaponize the system to go after their neighbors. I've also seen people dig their heels in and make things worse for themselves. My advice? Document everything. Keep records. If this turns into a pattern, you'll have a case for harassment." Alice appreciated the honesty, even if it didn't change much. It meant that Rebecca wasn't done. It meant that the restraining order, the police reports, the security cameras, none of it had deterred her. If anything, it had only made her more determined. And then, 3 nights later, Alice woke up to the sound of shattering glass. She was on her feet before she was even fully awake, heart hammering in her chest as she grabbed her phone and rushed toward the source of the noise, the kitchen, the back patio door. Her breath caught as she saw the jagged shards scattered across the floor, the curtain billowing slightly from the night breeze. Someone had thrown something through the glass. Her hands were shaking as she turned on the outside floodlights, scanning the backyard for movement. Nothing. No figures darting through the shadows, no retreating footsteps. But when she looked down at the broken glass, she saw something lying among the shards. A brick. And taped to it was a piece of paper. Alice crouched down slowly, peeling the note away from the rough surface. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was clear. "You don't belong here." Her fingers tightened around the paper, rage momentarily overpowering fear. This wasn't just Rebecca anymore. This was bigger. Multiple people wanted her gone. Someone had escalated things beyond petty harassment and into something more dangerous. The police arrived within 10 minutes, 2 officers sweeping the area while another took her statement. "No security footage?" the first officer asked, glancing at her camera system. Alice shook her head, jaw clenched. "The cameras cover the gate, the yard, but not this angle directly." The second officer nodded. "Could have been anyone. We'll check with the neighbors, see if anyone saw anything." Alice almost laughed. The neighbors? The same ones who had been whispering about her? The same ones who had conveniently ignored every other incident leading up to this? She didn't say anything, just watched as the officers collected the brick, took their notes, and promised they'd be in touch. She knew how this worked. There was no proof, no suspect, no immediate arrest. Just another report, another item on a growing list of incidents that meant nothing until something worse happened. As she locked up the house again, she realized something. She had been playing defense this whole time, reacting to Rebecca's provocations, waiting for her next move. That needed to change. Alice didn't just need to stop Rebecca. She needed to make sure Rebecca never tried something like this again. Alice had spent the entire next day reinforcing her house again, but no amount of security measures could erase the growing certainty in her mind this wasn't just about Rebecca anymore. The brick through her window, The note telling her she didn't belong here, the way the neighborhood had subtly turned against her. It was all too organized, too methodical to be just the tantrum of an entitled neighbor who didn't like being denied access to a pool. There was a system to it, a slow, calculated push to wear her down, to make her life in this house unbearable. And the worst part was that the police weren't going to do a damn thing about it until it escalated past the point of no return. She knew that from experience. She had spent years watching cases like this play out in courtrooms, knowing full well that victims rarely got help until it was too late. She wasn't about to be one of them. She didn't call Rebecca. She didn't go to her house, didn't confront her, didn't even acknowledge her existence when she passed by on the street. She had learned her lesson about engaging. Instead, she focused on gathering everything she needed. She compiled every report, every security clip, every piece of harassment that had happened since the first day Rebecca had shown up at her gate with that fake smile. She documented it all, every trespass, every interaction, every suspicious incident that had made her uneasy. She sent it all to Evelyn, who called her back within the hour. "You need to prepare for the possibility that she's not working alone in this," Evelyn said, her voice sharp and measured. "I don't just mean her husband or whoever she brought to your house that night. If you're right about the neighborhood closing ranks against you, then this might be something bigger than just her trying to make your life miserable." Alice exhaled slowly, gripping her phone tighter. "I don't understand. What would be the point? What do they gain from trying to drive me out?" Evelyn hesitated for just a beat too long before answering. "That's what we need to find out." That night Alice didn't sleep. She sat in her living room, lights off, watching the security feeds on her phone, waiting for something to happen. And sure enough, at 2:27 a.m. her phone buzzed with a motion alert. Someone was outside. She pulled up the feed, expecting to see Rebecca lurking near the fence again. But this time it wasn't just her. There were 3 figures. 2 men and Rebecca standing near her backyard gate. One of the men had bolt cutters. Alice's pulse slammed against her ribs as she grabbed her phone and called 911. She barely registered what she said, just that officers were being sent, that she needed to stay inside and keep doors locked. But she wasn't just going to sit there and wait. She turned on the floodlights, illuminating the yard in harsh white, and immediately the 3 of them froze. One of the men, the one with the bolt cutters, swore loudly and took a step back, but Rebecca didn't move. She just stood there, staring directly at the camera, her expression eerily calm, as if she had expected this, as if this was just another step in her plan. The police arrived within minutes, but by the time they got there, Rebecca and the 2 men were already gone. Alice showed them the footage, demanded that something be done, that this was an attempted break-in, but once again, there was nothing solid enough for an immediate arrest. The most they could do was add another report to the growing pile and promise to look into it. Alice felt something cold settle in her chest as she locked up the house once more. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This wasn't just intimidation. This was Rebecca testing how far she could go, how much she could get away with. And now that she knew the police weren't going to act, unless something catastrophic happened, she was only going to get bolder. The next morning, Alice received an email notification from her security system. It wasn't unusual her cameras logged every movement, from passing cars to stray animals, but when she opened it, she felt the blood drain from her face. The footage was from just before dawn, after the police had already left. Rebecca had come back, alone. The footage showed her standing in Alice's driveway, staring up at the house. She wasn't trying to get in, wasn't damaging anything. She was just standing there, watching. And then, after almost 15 minutes of complete stillness, she walked over to Alice's car, reached into her pocket, and pulled something out. A key. Alice's stomach twisted. Rebecca crouched, reached under the car, and without hesitation placed the key on the ground beneath it, tucking it just far enough back that it wasn't immediately visible. Then she turned and walked away. Alice felt her breath coming in short, uneven bursts. What the hell was this? What kind of game was Rebecca playing? Why would she leave a key? Was it meant to rattle her? To make her question how many copies Rebecca had? Or worse, was it someone else's key? A setup? She didn't touch it. Instead, she took a picture, then called Evelyn. "This is psychological warfare," Evelyn said after Alice explained what happened. "She's trying to make you paranoid, make you doubt everything, make you feel unsafe in your own home. And she's doing a damn good job of it." Alice swallowed hard. "So what do? You document it. You file another report. And you don't engage." Alice followed every step. She photographed the key, sent it to the police along with the footage, and when an officer arrived later that day, she let him collect it. She refused to let Rebecca dictate her next move. But deep down, she knew she was running out of time. That night she barely slept, dozing off only to wake up at the slightest noise, every creak of the house setting her on edge. And then, just past 3 in the morning, she heard something different. Not the wind, not the settling of the foundation, something closer. Someone was inside the house. Alice's entire body locked up, adrenaline flooding her system as she reached for her phone. But before she could dial, she heard footsteps. Slow, measured. Not the hurried shuffle of a burglar searching for valuables, but something worse. Someone moving through the house with purpose. She didn't think. She acted. She grabbed the panic button attached to her nightstand, pressing it hard. The alarm blared through the house instantly, a piercing, shrieking wail that shattered the silence. The footsteps stopped abruptly. Then, the sound of retreat. Alice waited, heart pounding, gripping her phone in one hand and a heavy flashlight in the other. She didn't dare leave the room. Instead, she listened. Footsteps moving quickly, a door opening, the faint rustling of someone slipping out into the night. When the police arrived, they found the back door unlocked, but no signs of forced entry. No broken windows, no jimmied locks. Whoever had been inside had used a key. And Alice knew with absolute certainty who it had been. Rebecca had stopped lurking. She had stopped testing boundaries. Now, she was inside the house. Alice sat in the living room, gripping a cup of coffee that had long gone cold, staring at the back door where the intruder had escaped just hours before. The police had taken her statement, checked the house, and predictably left without offering anything other than the usual assurances that they would increase patrols in the neighborhood and look into it. She had watched them drive away, feeling no safer than before. The realization was setting in, a heavy weight pressing against her chest. She was on her own. The police wouldn't protect her. The system wouldn't act unless she ended up in a hospital or worse. Rebecca had tested the boundaries, had found exactly where the cracks in the system lay, and had exploited them to the fullest. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a deliberate, methodical breakdown of Alice's security, her sanity, her very sense of control. And it wasn't going to stop unless Alice stopped it herself. She knew now that she had been too passive, too focused on reacting instead of acting. She had spent too much time thinking like a civilian, trusting that logical boundaries and legal processes would contain someone like Rebecca. But Rebecca didn't operate within normal logic. She didn't care about laws or consequences. She cared about control, and Alice knew exactly how to deal with people who needed control more than they needed their own dignity. She had done it before, back when she was deep in the world of litigation, dealing with men who thought they could manipulate, intimidate, and outmaneuver their way out of responsibility. She had spent years dismantling people who thought they were untouchable. She had just never expected to need those skills to deal with a psychotic neighbor. She wasn't going to run. She wasn't going to hide in a hotel or sell her house in fear. If Rebecca wanted to push her, she would push back. She started with the security measures. Her home was already reinforced, but now she took it further. She contacted a private security firm and had them install a silent alarm system, one that wouldn't blare through the house like the last one, but would instead send an immediate alert to law enforcement and a private response team. She had motion sensors placed in the hallways, hidden cameras positioned inside the house, not just outside. She changed the locks again, this time installing a secondary deadbolt system that required a key from the inside to unlock. And then she waited. Rebecca didn't disappoint. 2 nights later, Alice was awake, watching the security feeds from her phone, when she caught movement near the back fence. The feed flickered slightly before going dark. The cameras had been cut. Alice exhaled slowly. She had expected that. She set her phone down, rose from her seat, and moved to the hallway, positioning herself near the staircase, out of direct sight. She listened. The sound of a lock being tested. Then, the faintest creak of a door opening. She had left it unlocked on purpose. Footsteps. Slow, careful, moving across the hardwood floor. Not the rushed scurry of a burglar. Not the panicked hesitation of someone second-guessing their actions. No, these footsteps were steady, assured. They belonged to someone who thought they were in control. Someone who had convinced themselves they had already won. Alice felt no fear. She let the intruder move deeper into the house, letting the silence stretch, letting them feel safe, letting them think they had the upper hand. And then she moved. She stepped into the hallway, her presence suddenly filling the space, and the figure stopped dead. Rebecca. She stood in the middle of the living room, dressed in dark clothes, her expression frozen somewhere between shock and amusement. "Alice," she said, her voice smooth, controlled, like she wasn't standing in someone else's house in the middle of the night. "I didn't expect you to be awake." Alice tilted her head slightly, studying her. She could see it now, the subtle tension in her posture, the way her fingers flexed slightly at her sides. Rebecca wasn't as composed as she wanted to appear. "You didn't expect me to be prepared," either Alice said, her voice calm, almost conversational. "But here we are." Rebecca exhaled a soft laugh, shaking her head. "You're making this more difficult than it needs to be. You don't belong here, Alice. This house, this neighborhood, it's not for people like you." Alice took a slow step forward, watching as Rebecca stiffened slightly. "And what kind of person am I, exactly?" Rebecca's eyes flickered, and for the first time, Alice saw something real beneath the mask of entitlement, something raw, something ugly. "An outsider," she said finally, her voice quiet but sharp. "A disruption. Someone who doesn't understand how things work." Alice let the words settle, absorbing the weight of them. "And what, exactly, was your plan tonight? Were you going to scare me? Steal something? Hurt me?" Rebecca's lips curled into something resembling a smirk, but it didn't reach her eyes. "I didn't have to do anything," she said, her voice almost amused. "You were already unraveling on your own." Alice nodded, as if considering that. Then, in one sharp movement, she pulled her phone from her pocket and tapped the screen. "Too bad for you," she said, watching as Rebecca's smirk faded. "You weren't as quiet as you thought." The sound of sirens filled the air outside, growing louder, closer. Rebecca's face flickered with something Alice had never seen before: fear. Not rage, not frustration. Actual, genuine fear. Alice stepped closer, lowering her voice just enough that only Rebecca could hear. "This is where your little game ends." Rebecca's breath hitched slightly, and for the first time she looked small, vulnerable. And then, just as quickly, the mask slipped back into place. But it didn't matter. Alice had already won. Alice stood on her porch, watching as the police led Rebecca away in handcuffs. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the street, casting sharp shadows against the perfectly manicured lawns and pristine houses that had once seemed so idyllic. Neighbors had gathered, standing in small clusters on their driveways, watching the scene unfold with the kind of hushed fascination reserved for tragedies that happen close enough to be interesting, but not close enough to be personal. No one approached Alice. No one asked if she was all right. They just watched, murmuring among themselves, exchanging glances, as if silently debating whether they had been on the wrong side of the story this entire time. She didn't care. Rebecca had spent weeks, months even, trying to make her feel unwelcome, trying to force her out through intimidation, manipulation, and outright criminal acts. But in the end, all she had managed to do was destroy herself. The police had arrived within minutes of Alice triggering the silent alarm, catching Rebecca inside the house with no reasonable explanation for why she was there. She had tried to talk her way out of it, of course. She had smiled that practiced, self-assured smile and told the officers that this was all a misunderstanding, that she had only come to talk, that she and Alice had been having a disagreement that had gotten out of hand. But the officers hadn't been interested in her charm. They had seen the reports, the history of trespassing, the break-in attempts, the harassment, and more importantly, they had seen the footage. Alice had made sure everything was recorded the moment Rebecca entered the house, the way she moved through the space like she belonged there, the way she had stood in the living room, waiting for Alice, expecting her to be afraid. That footage had sealed Rebecca's fate. There was no twisting it, no plausible excuse that could make sense of why she had entered a locked home in the middle of the night. Trespassing had become breaking and entering. Harassment had become a crime, and no amount of privilege or manipulation was going to erase the fact that Rebecca had finally crossed a line she couldn't step back from. Alice didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel relieved. Not yet. She just felt exhausted. By the time the last officer left and the neighborhood returned to its usual quiet, Alice was drained in a way she hadn't been prepared for. She locked the doors, checked the windows, and sat on the couch, staring at nothing. It was over. At least the immediate threat was. But the damage Rebecca had done, the way she had made Alice question everything, the way she had systematically broken down her sense of security, wasn't something that would disappear overnight. Alice had spent weeks living in fear, waiting for the next escalation, bracing for the moment things would turn violent. And now that it had happened, now that the worst had finally come and gone, she wasn't sure how to feel. The next few days passed in a blur. Rebecca was formally charged, denied bail due to the severity of the stalking allegations, and placed under a restraining order so ironclad that even if by some miracle she managed to avoid jail time, she would never be able to come near Alice's house again. Evelyn had handled everything with ruthless efficiency, ensuring that the case was airtight, that Rebecca wouldn't be able to slither out of it with excuses or legal loopholes. Alice knew she should feel safer now. She had won. But the paranoia didn't fade. Every noise in the house still made her jump. Every time she stepped outside, she found herself scanning the street, half expecting to see Rebecca watching from the shadows, that eerie smile still in place. Trauma didn't vanish just because the danger was gone. The turning point came a week later when Alice received a letter in the mail. She had hesitated before opening it, her pulse spiking at the sight of an unmarked envelope. But when she finally tore it open, the breath she had been holding escaped in a sharp exhale. It wasn't from Rebecca. It was from one of the other neighbors, a woman she barely knew, someone who had never spoken to her directly before. I should have said something sooner. I saw what was happening, but I didn't want to get involved. I didn't realize how far it had gone. I'm sorry. It wasn't much. It wasn't an admission of guilt, wasn't a grand gesture of apology from the community that had turned a blind eye while Rebecca tormented her. But it was something. It was proof that people had known, that they had seen the signs, that Rebecca's influence had been stronger than just her own twisted determination. Alice wondered how many of them had whispered behind closed doors, debating whether or not to intervene, whether or not they should say something. In the end, none of them had. They had let it happen. And now that it was over, only one of them had the decency to acknowledge it. Alice didn't write back. She didn't need to. Instead, she did something she hadn't done in months. She went outside alone, without looking over her shoulder, without checking the security feeds first. She sat by the pool, the water calm and undisturbed, and let herself breathe. She wasn't afraid anymore. Not of Rebecca. Not of the neighbors. Not of the house she had fought so hard to keep. She had won. And she was finally ready to live again,